Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place, and today I'm going to be talking about Aggro Crab's Going Under, a game that tasks players with exploring the seedy underbelly of startup companies. Albeit a bit more literally, given that the game's an action roguelite. Which is to say, join me as I go on a grand venture to see if I felt Going Under was a capital idea or a creatively bankrupt experience. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. A name like Jackie Fiasco seems portentous, as though you might be destined for great things. And you would be wrong. So very wrong. Instead, you're an intern at the not-so-prestigiously named Fizzle, a startup devoted to making cutting-edge carbonated meal supplements whose flavors might be a bit questionable. Which is squint-worthy in itself, but made all the worse when you realize that its success is built on the ruins of earlier ventures. And I mean this literally, given that Fizzle's parent company Cubicle runs an office building built over the monstrous shells of myriad failed ventures. And it just so happens that your manager needs your help in clearing them out, which means it's time to roll up your sleeves and prove you're a go-getter by diving into the Going Under world and engaging in some aggressive organizational rearrangement through the halls of Joblin, Styxcoin, and more. And if you're thinking this all sounds balls to the wall silly, you're absolutely right. Going Under is, at its core, a weird, pun-laden bit of satire lampooning venture capitalism, work culture, and the joys of being an unpaid intern. And frankly, I really enjoyed it. If it's not abundantly apparent, I love a good bit of wordplay and some clever gags, and Going Under does a decent job of marrying this with its world building. That said, it also provides a decent story to follow along with, to the point that I found myself looking forward to clearing areas and advancing the central plot threads. Though I wasn't too hard-pressed even if I failed, because there was still stuff to do between runs. After all, hanging out with your colleagues at Fizzle is fun, as you're given the opportunity to chat with them during your downtime. A habit which quickly led me to undertaking all of their mentor quests. While there are some neat mechanical benefits for doing this, the major reason that I engaged with them was simply because they served to flesh out the characters a bit more, and had led to some fun little scenes as I progressed forward. In fact, I enjoyed them so much I burned through all of that content before I reached the game's second act, which did make that segment hit a bit harder on a narrative front, though it also left my constant back and forth between dungeons and the base feel a bit emptier by that juncture. That's not to say there weren't a few scenes in store for progressing forward, but it felt notably emptier of the smaller segments and dialogue, even despite the radical changes that occur, which left me diving into the game's optional imposter content in search of more lore tidbits. Other than that, the only thing that comes to mind lore-wise is the Rolodex entries, which are collectibles which often provide punny bits of flavor text about the various enemies and bosses, provided you can capture them. That said, as much as I found the story to be relatively lighthearted and easy to get into, the gameplay was, well, Going Under is hard. As far as action roguelites go, I was not expecting it to be anywhere near as challenging as it turned out to be. And one of the most notable factors in this isn't the overall fragility of the protagonist, it's the fact that she's tossed into each of the game's dungeons with nothing to her name, and obliged to survive by improvising with anything on hand. Pencils, potted plants, chairs, anything you can pick up can be swung or thrown. But there's some stipulations to be mindful of. For one thing, not all office supplies are made equal, and some simply aren't that suitable to being used as a weapon, to the point that they lack combos or even the ability to stun an enemy. Secondly, even if you do find a sword or spear that can unleash a better beatdown, all of the items you acquire are fairly fragile. Whilst this is an option that you can tweak in the game's accessibility features, in the vanilla experience, it's not uncommon to have a weapon break on you in a short amount of time, especially when dealing with crowds. Pair that with only being able to carry a limited amount of items, and you find yourself facing a very tactical consideration for what type of weapon you should be picking up and when to use them, especially when you factor in how differently some feel for their combos and alternate attacks, and the sort of enemies you're currently facing off against. That said, I'd be lying if I just chalked it up to the weapons. Another key element in your upcoming suffrage is the overall lack of iframes you have, both in regards to your dodge roll and your hit recovery. That's right, you can botch a dodge and then eat another hit or two while you're reorienting yourself. And if there's some area hazards that knock you over while you're near some enemies, you can just kiss all your health goodbye, which is made especially bad once you come to terms with how sparse healing items often feel. That's not to say you don't have options, but the cost of recovery items are steep and often so prohibitively expensive that they prevent you from accessing the avenues you need to progress, which is pretty painful when you're still trying to learn the ropes of the various dungeons, because to Going Under's credit, each area does have its own unique quirks to understand and overcome. Whether it's their own hateful hierons, the office supplies that become scrounged in each sector, the environmental hazards that'll be at play, or even the types of secrets an event you'll encounter. Each startup has its own flavor of fun. Winky Dink, for instance, occasionally provides weird Tinder-esque rooms where you can swipe right on a monster in order to date it. If dating involved violence and a flawless or near finish was enough to make a lasting impression. As questionable as all of that is, it did give me a minion for the mission, and that's far from the extent of the weird and surreal stuff you'll encounter. Especially given just how quickly you can ramp up through the dungeons, because despite being a roguelite, Going Under is fairly snappy, at least insofar as its basic gameplay, as you only have a few floors to scour for resources before your scheduled face-to-face meeting with the various founders, see bosses. Still, as brutal as things are, there are a few elements which help to ease the pain of progressing. Getting good. Failing that, though, there's perks. Essentially, these are passive skills you can pick up which help to better flesh out Jackie. By default, you'll have the opportunity to acquire 3 of them per floor, with a pair of choices in Ye Olde Skill Room, 1 at the shop, and a final skill gifted to you in the room leading to the next floor down. Which sounds nice, but well, all skills are not created equal, and while some are fairly obvious about what they do, others are, well, volatile, for instance, is not the most straightforward descriptor, especially when you compare it to skills like makes you stronger the more money you have, which is a problem that extends out of the dungeon too, given that you have to spend your hard-earned cubits, a meta resource that you steadily accrued that's used for this, and buying blank cards to expand your Rolodex. Though again, to Going Under's credit, it does immediately spawn whatever skills you buy into your next run, so you get the opportunity to try them out ASAP. Which also provides you the means of mastering the perk, because if you use a perk long enough, it becomes endorsed, adding it to a library of skills you can start out with. Though, choose carefully here since you can actually only bring in 1 endorsed skill. That said, this isn't the full extent of pre-run prep work you can do either. Earlier in the review, I did mention the mentor quests. Essentially, these are tasks presented to you by senior members of Fizzle, which not only provide you story bits, they also provide you a slowly growing assortment of modifiers when you have that specific mentor selected. Ray, for instance, is very useful for getting a slew of perks, given that he causes an extra perk room to spawn. He also lets you drive his car around in the levels, which is just a trip. That said, given that I like the money as power perk, I use Tappy, as amongst her many modifiers, one simply causes more money to drop, which also makes it easier to make use of the shops to boot. It's actually really nice once you unlock the full array of their capabilities, because the latter half of the game really isn't fucking around. See, once the other shoe drops for things on a narrative front, you're introduced to the mean bits. Everything up until this point was just foreplay for the true Founder dungeons, which are essentially remixed variants of the original ones, albeit with new enemies, traps, and even bosses. It was at this point where, even with all of the extra starting health the first half of the game provided, I found myself getting beaten to a pulp a lot more consistently. Stuff's just hard. And it doesn't even stop there either, because early on, you then find yourself introduced to the Imposter, a shadowy mirror of Jackie a la Darklink if he was a ruthless, demeaning corporate shill. What's notable about this encounter, though, is the fact that it provides access to the Imposter dungeons, a far lengthier experience which randomly chains the various startup areas into a 10-floor bonanza of suffering, even including elements of the true Founder variants during the latter half of your dives. Which is made even more brutal once you realize that A, you no longer gain skills in the final rooms of each floor, B, shop prices continue to scale for all of the 10 floors, and C, the sheer difficulty of this place continues to scale up because Imposter Mode has several difficulty levels, all of which are carefully formulated to be a bad time. I won't fib. I actually dived into the accessibility options for these just to make the dodge roll suck a little less here, because it is a doozy, especially once you lose the ability to gain max health and take damage for learning perks. Which might have you wondering, what would make all this suffering worthwhile? And to that, I say, fashion. Yeah, you can unlock all sorts of alternate outfits for Jackie by progressing through certain dungeons, though the bulk of them are locked behind tiers of the imposter dungeon, such as imitation crab flavored Jackie. Because yes, behold the pinnacle of evolution, the crustacean devastation. And that's far from the crux of the weirdness you'll be seeing, because Going Under does a fairly decent job of incorporating its visuals into the weird world building and gags. Whilst it took me a bit to get used to its presentation style, once I did, I found myself noticing all sorts of weird graphical puns. For instance, just take a good hard look at how you leave a completed dungeon. It's actually pretty darn clever. That said, as much as I appreciated the various animations, the part that really stuck in my brain was the music. The game's soundtrack is pretty darn energetic, with all of its areas and bosses having their own distinct themes, which was nice enough to begin with, but got especially nifty once I reached the Founder dungeons and found myself encountering remixed variants of those earlier tracks. It's good stuff to the point that I literally will sit there and listen to this game's playlist on YouTube to this day. But yeah, was it good enough to round out my experience? Yes. Okay, the answer is just yes, and that's despite the fact that I initially got into this game and found myself baffled by the item durability system and the overall difficulty of the experience. And yet, as I slowly grew more comfortable with the ebb and flow of its combat, the quirk of its perks, and the hurdles for each of the hostile workplaces I invaded, it clicked for me. To the point that I was bouncing between this and Ender Lilies when I was burnt out from my experiences with Mists of Noya. That's right, to give you context, I have been working on this script since I released Mists of Noya, and this is part of what saved me from that hellish experience with that game. Like, I'll definitely admit that I progressed a lot slower in Going Under once I reached the game's midpoint. The increase in difficulty at that juncture was steep, to the point that my comfortable win-loss ratio was rapidly overshadowed by failure. So if the first part felt too easy, welcome home. Though if you're concerned about the idea of getting barred from finishing off the mentor quest if you accidentally progress forward, the game is kind enough to provide you the option of powering down the dungeons. Whilst you can't progress the story while they're like that, it does provide you the opportunity to endorse more skills or mop up mentor quests, which is rather forgiving, especially in tandem with the accessibility system. That said, I think it's rather telling that even after I got to witness the end of the central narrative, I still found myself puttering around in the game, both to experiment with skills I hadn't unlocked, as well as to simply finish off the imposter dungeons despite how dickishly difficult they got. Suffice to say, I can safely call this game a solid crit hit. I can just recommend it to just about anyone I think of, because despite how difficult it has the means of being accessible to anyone and also providing a proper challenge to anyone seeking it out. It is just solid. It is narratively fun. It is just good. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy seeing new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. That said, if you want to find my Twitch or my Discord community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description for them links, and to my Patreon, where you can support me and Hop, and also get a possible hint at some of the stuff I'm working on, since I'm going to be posting things up to there possibly weeks before it arrives on YouTube. In any case, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.